everybody.
It's called editing.
Good to see you.
Bye.
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 Bye, Dean. Oh, so you rode your bike.
Did.
Okay.
You'll be in shape.
I already am.
It's true.
See you
Every
later.
day.
See you later.
Bye.
Okay, so thank you for participating. Just wanted to mention that. So the first question is, what waterway here in Los Angeles has a story you want to share that resonates with you personally or your larger community?
We always
She
do
al-
this. We always
you
let
always do that to me. She looks at me all
Because
the
I
time.
want him to speak first.
I think, and this is just something that I just realized recently, is I was talking to somebody about it earlier, was the Zanja Madre, the mother ditch,
Okay, yeah.
and how that affected a lot of the indigenous people in Los Angeles, in downtown Los Angeles, during the 1830s and 40s, and how it was kind of the beginning of the displacement of these people in their already relocated refugee camps. And because there are stories that I've read about a lot of the Pueblo individuals, the townspeople, were becoming upset that a lot of the Indian women were washing their clothes, and the people in general were just washing. The indigenous people were using that for washing, and they were concerned about the cleanliness of the water. But I also thought about, and that was one of the reasons why they decided to move the camp from Aliso and Alameda to across the river, aside from other reasons. But I was thinking, well, where else did these people have to go? I need to do this stuff.
Right.
They were already displaced in many ways, and that ditch was one of the only close water sources for them to use, and they were used to living like that traditionally. While the other townspeople were having water brought to them, in jugs, and these people didn't have another water source. So just that story in and of itself, it talks about the whole beginning of the displacement, the consecutive displacement of these people because of their use of that main water ditch, the Zanja Madre, and how it affected them for generations after that.
Right. That's very good. Thank you.
Yeah, and it also, I think it's the beginning of the control of the water. Because adjacent to that is the Los Angeles River, which is a significant water source, waterway in Los Angeles today. And it's in pre-contact times, and in earliest times, it wasn't confined in cement, so it traveled, and the people moved with the river.
Right.
And once you're confined from that traditional way of living, it's not being nomadic, it's just living with the sources that you have, then it becomes very, very controlled. You're confined within like geopolitical space, within the Pueblo, and you no longer have the rights to really wander around, so that's for the Zanja. They're using water in the same way. But I always, in my imagination, because we don't have those answers, we don't have images. Photography was not in effect at that time, in those earliest times, so we don't have photographs, we have stories. And exactly what did the Los Angeles River look like, and how did the people use it at that time?
Right.
And we know that seasonally they had droughts as they happen now, and you had your flooding. But the LA River, as far as we have been educated about it within our families, we know that it's not the type of river that always had water continuously flowing through it. That's one of the characteristics of water in California, is we have a lot of underground water with the springs, artesian wells, and the rivers as well. So because we don't see visible water, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Right.
And
Good point.
Yeah, so people commonly think that we have an absence of water in Southern California. It's not as if you're living in other states where you, like in Alaska, and you have the Kenai River continually flowing. it's very, very different type of an environment here. It wasn't always green, you know, but water is always present. Unfortunately, today, a lot of those natural sources of water with the springs and the artesian wells, as part of that control, they cap the water. So people don't have access to it. You know, the water is maneuvered and shifted into other areas.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think, you know, just to add to it also, because when people think of the water, they usually think of watersheds and rivers and creeks and things like
Right.
that. And they don't really think about the springs as much. And I remember reading over the memoirs of a Serrano woman, Dorothy Ramon, who she talks about this in her memoirs, and I guess it was Eric Elliott that had written down a lot of her stories.
Mhm.
And in her story, one of the things she talks about are the springs, and saying that when they wanted drinking water, they always got it from the springs. They didn't get it from the creeks and the rivers, because you never know who was using it. People think of contamination in a contemporary sense, but even back then, upriver, you didn't know who was using the water and what they were doing to it, so it wasn't considered safe even in those days. So the springs were the freshest source of water to get, and she talks about that, saying that we never got water to drink from the rivers, it was from the springs.
Yeah, rivers were for washing, springs were for
And
drinking.
bathing, yeah.
How interesting.
And it's also something that we've heard too, as far as what you would drink.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously today we have lots of different choices. We have hundreds of choices of what we could drink. And when you hear of people talking about, like when they're sick and they ask for sweet water, like in the case of Ishi, you know, Ishi, the Yahi Indian back that Alfred Kroeber back in 1960,
Yeah.
I think he passes away, but before he leaves and before he dies, one of the last thing he asked for is for sweet water. And he never touched water that was dark or colored. So water was the health of the people. It was the health of your health. So that's what they were looking for, that quality of water, which we don't have today. And as
Right.
Craig said, yes, pollutants. I mean, there was even conversations about you don't know if somebody intentionally would poison, the people who live upriver would intentionally poison or pollute your water if you had a feud ongoing with them, or there was some kind of dissension between communities, that they could always send stuff, bad stuff downriver to you.
So it could be a form of like warfare. The water, in a way.
Certainly could be a way of getting back at people.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the other question, what are some of your thoughts about water in general in Los Angeles?
How we're lacking it. People don't value it.
Yeah,
You know, we're back to that, what water is. We are water.
yeah,
Water is that which connects us. It makes us all related to each other.
right,
And we forget that. We neglect water.
yeah. And then your comment about value, what do you like mean by the word value? Like, some people here in Los Angeles look at water as something they just pay for. and-
It's a resource, and we
Yeah.
use that word resource. Resource means what? Resource means we use things up
Right,
rather than cherish it and take care of it.
yeah,
So water as a resource means it's consumable. It's part of the consumer process.
right,
So there's a lack of consciousness. There's a lack of responsibility.
yeah.
Because we just assume that somebody's gonna resolve this drought issue, somebody's gonna resolve the water issue for us rather
Yeah.
than us taking personal responsibility.
Mhm.
Whereas in traditional ways, the
Mhm.
water is your life, the water is sacred.
Mhm.
It's our responsibility.
Yeah.
Because for you to violate something that is sacred would result in something bad coming back to your own family.
Yeah,
Which can be lack of water, lack of health,
yeah,
and we don't have that.
yeah.
It's that consciousness that people have lost, because in the old days, everything, you know, was viewed as having spirit. you know, being alive, and you know, even the springs were protected by spirits too, and
Mhm.
you know, you had better approach those in the right way, otherwise, you know, like she's talking about, it would come back to you.
Mhm.
And we've even lost that connection too, is honoring that, you know, and viewing that as a life force.
Yeah.
You know, you know, it's become a commodity and something that people take for granted and think is going to be there forever. But
Right.
in those old days, you were very conscious of that, because you did have those spirits that protected the water. You know, especially associated with springs too.
Right.
Yeah, and if you know, if you approached that in the wrong way or abused it, it would come back to you.
That's very good. Thank
And
you.
there's different forms of water.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about fresh water, but then you enter into the other worlds, you know, because when you look at the traditional maps, which in contemporary society we have topographical maps, we have political maps, so
Mhm.
it's all just kind of a very linear horizontal. But when you get into dimensional mapping,
Mhm.
and the underworld is the watery world.
It's so true.
And
Yeah.
we leave what we consider the mainland, we go off the coast of California into the ocean, and there's a whole complete world under the ocean.
Right. Yeah.
Which science has validated that now, that there's valleys and there's rivers
Mhm.
and there's mountains and, you know, there's landforms underneath there.
Right.
And that's where the deities, for lack of failure to find another term,
Yeah.
some of the most sacred of the deities lived in the underworld.
Mhm.
So, you know, like in the maritime culture, when we're traveling on that water, we're in their heaven. We're floating above them
Mm-hmm.
with that confidence that they're going to protect us, unless we violate that water, unless
Right.
we violate their world.
Right.
Then there's consequences to that.
Right.
That water gives us life too.
Yeah.
The seals, the whales, the fishes, the abalone.
And that's the source of healing too. The salt water has
Mhm.
always been that,
Mhm.
you know, for a lot
Yeah.
of us, for our families, and
Yeah.
you know, because even people today, you know, when you know they think of healing themselves, they use salt water, but it's always been viewed that way as you know, something that will heal you.
Which was a practice in our family with my father, an abalone diver, not a commercial abalone diver, but he was a diver,
Skin diver.
a skin diver, yes, which is very rare. That's more traditional. You dive very, you know. And so when we were sick, he would take us to the ocean and we would bathe in the water. But also, if we had a cold, which you would do today, they use neti pots, right?
Yes.
Okay, so he would take the water, and we learned at a very young age how to take the water, breathe it in through our nose, and take it through our whole sinus system and spit it,
Drink. Oh,
and
wow.
cleanse ourselves. That's what we would do. I wouldn't do it today because the water's so polluted.
Right.
It'd be very dangerous, but at that time, I mean, and the water was much cleaner then.
Yeah.
And the sources of water, where he would get it even on the ocean, you know, he would go
Mhm.
out and get the water deeper, not on the coast.
Yeah.
So it's that's part of the medicine that you lose in contemporary society, because we don't think of it. We don't think of the water as, we think of it as a resource, as something that's like buying a refrigerator or a couch or something. It's gonna get ruined and we can just go get some more. No, that's not the way it is.
Right.
You know, even ownership of water.
Yeah.
How do you own water? It flows and it flows and it flows
so
to
true.
different places, and everybody belongs to it.
Yeah. That's so true. What about trade routes or trade sources where you would trade at certain, like, would you ever trade at a spring or like a lake or a river?
I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know. I've never heard of that. That's an interesting concept.
There's-
You certainly would share the resource. I mean, you
Right.
share that water space.
Mhm.
If that'd be like collecting and gathering,
Right.
like a space where there's a lot of abalone or your
Right.
sea vegetables,
Yeah.
or gathering tules or
Mhm.
your basketry plants or the different vegetables, you know, where there's an abundance.
Right.
I'm sure that whoever had access, if that was within their traditional land base or where their family land, their
Mhm.
clan was, I'm sure there was negotiations.
And then you have to remember too is in those days, like I had talked about earlier, there were spirits associated with certain places, you know, caves and springs, and you know, and you always had a offer to that place too. It wasn't always seen as a place where just people went and you know, recreation. It was, they were places that, you know, you either went there when it was very necessary or you avoided altogether.
Yeah.
You know, and there are stories about water spirits drowning people, you know,
Yeah.
calling them into the water and drowning, you
Yeah.
know, and even in contemporary times, things like that. So it's not just seen as something like that. There's also places that you had to be respectful of and, you know, and honor. And I think that even in modern times, you know, when people have issues with that, you know, in spirits, you know, you see a lot of these shows on TV with houses being haunted. I think it's because people just don't honor these spirits, whether it be a human spirit or a spirit of the land. They just don't, they've lost that connection with what it is to honor the spirit. Aside from human interaction, you know, they don't see it. They don't see the land as being alive or the water as being alive, but
Right.
it is.
Yeah, that's a good point too, because it shows the diversity of water too, the source of water and what that means.
Right.
In Tahunga Canyon, when we would go there, there's places where you'd have these deep, just like a pond of water, and my dad would tell us you don't go towards that water because there's water babies in there. They're like these water spirits.
Yeah.
And if you disrespect them, he would tell me they'd pull you under.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about. So, you know, there, whatever his source of that information, I mean, that was handed down, and was that water only for healing that was approached by, you know, somebody who was like a medicine person, or there's a special way that you introduce yourself to that water, the way that you gather that water, the way that you use that water.
Yeah.
So there's different types of water, the qualities of water, salt water, fresh water, underground water, where it's traveled through. If it traveled through, like under Pavungna, over at Cal State Long Beach, I think that's probably more unique than it being like on a national register of historic places. The more unique characteristic of Cal State Long Beach is because the water underneath it, there's an abundance of water. The water tables are so high over at Cal State Long Beach. It becomes problematic during rainy seasons, where there's some areas that it becomes like ponds, because you're so close to the ocean again. Then you have the wetlands.
Oh, wow.
So you have the salt water, and you have the fresh water, and you have these wetlands. You know, even where we're at here, the wetlands probably came in. I mean, this land was probably very different.
Right.
We know how the water moves, and the character and the personality of the water